Hello and welcome to the second episode of the playthrough for Scenario 1 of Albuera Second Edition. We're going to finish the scenario today and pick up where we left it at the end of the last episode, which is the start of the 11 o'clock AM turn. Okay, so we start at 11 AM as indicated by the markers on the game turn clock. The weather is still clear, it stays clear for the whole scenario. All the fatigue markers are still in the green zone, so no effect due to fatigue so far. And we have two routed units from the Spanish army in the routed units box on the right side. So the first thing to do in the rally phase is to try to rally those two units. We'll pick them up from the box and roll for them. First, the Spanish guards, we roll a 1, so that's a rally. The unit is therefore placed under a disorder marker. Then we roll for the Murcia unit. Also a lucky roll, that's another rally. That unit is also placed under a disorder marker. And then both units will be placed back on the map. Now the three requirements to place a unit back on the map after it rallies is that the unit must be at least 8 hexes away from any enemy combat unit, must have a line of hexes free of enemy unit in reaction zone leading to one of its depot, and maybe must be placed in range of its leader. In this case, the first conditions are met. The third one cannot be met, but they still can be placed there. If you remember, in the last episode we rolled a 9 when we rolled for ammunition depletion on the supply train, and we forgot to draw a special event card, so we're going to draw it now and give it to the French player. We drew Form on Me, which is a card that affects units in the routed units box, so the French player doesn't have any units over there right now, so it's not going to be very useful to him at the moment. Now that it's done, we can start the operations phase by selecting a leader for each army. In this case, we select Girard for the French, and the Spanish select Zayas. Girard will act first. The artillery unit fires on the Spanish infantry unit in line. We roll a 6, that's too high, no effect. Roll for depletion, no effect. That first battalion moves, enters the reaction zone of the Spanish infantry. Spanish infantry has a 0 skirmish factor, so there's no skirmish roll. So it declares an assault, fails the test, then declares a fire, and inflicts 1 straggler's loss and a TEM check on the Spanish unit. The check is passed, so there is no further effect. We just place a straggler's marker on the unit. The next unit to act will try to fire on the Spanish units on the hill. They don't want to assault because the odds would not be in their favor, so they're just going to try to fire on the stack that has 4 steps, so it's got a bonus when it fires. Unfortunately, the roll is too high. It needed to roll a 5, and so there is no effect from that fire. The next unit moves down the hill and goes to stack with the unit that just fired. It cannot stack on top and fire again because there was already a fire action that was declared in that hex, so it has to stop at the bottom of the hex. We continue the CG's activation by moving the 2 battalions on the ridge. One of them moves 1 hex and the other one moves into the reaction zone of the Spanish unit, passes the skirmish check, and then passes the assault check, so it's placed under a fixed bayonets marker. Now we just noticed there was a problem on the game board. One of the disorder markers was moved from one stack to another between the 2 recording sessions, so we're going to move that marker back on the stack where it belongs. That stack will attempt to reform with the help of Gazan that's stacked with them. It's adjacent to an enemy unit, but that enemy unit doesn't have a reaction zone because it's also disordered, so the stack is allowed to make reform attempts. The first roll is bad, but it's a 9, so we can draw another special event card for the French player. And the second roll is also bad, so neither of the units manage to reform, they stay disordered. Finally, the last stack of Girard's CG will attempt to assault the unit across the Arroyo Seco and uphill. It's going to be a difficult roll because of the modifiers. It's -2 TEM for the Arroyo Seco and -1 for the hill. That's another fail and another 9, so we are allowed to draw an extra card for the French. However, because the French player already has 2 special events cards, he's going to have to discard one, and because the card is not very useful because it affects order implementation, which is not used in this scenario, the French player right away discards it and keeps his other 2 cards. The unit then attempts to fire, but unfortunately the fire has no effect. So that's the end of Girard's CG's activation, so his card is put on the activated leader pile. Zayas finds himself on top of the activation stack, so the French leader has to select one of his leaders to compare SR ratings. He selects Pépin and decides to activate him first. We start by firing with the artillery units. It's 4 hexes away, so it's got a -2 modifier for that, but it's got +1 because the unit is in column and has more than 4 steps. A roll of 3 is enough to inflict a straggler's result and a TEM check. The TEM check is failed, and so the unit is placed under disorders and stragglers marker. We check for depletion again, no effect. The next unit moves, attempts an assault check, succeeds, and is placed under a fixed bayonets marker. Another move, another assault check, that one fails. The unit then fires and manages to inflict stragglers to the Spanish infantry, already under a straggler's marker, so that becomes a full step loss, and then a TM check. That check is failed, so the stack retreats in route after losing another step. The French player then finishes the CG's activation by moving the last stack. The next leader to be chosen by the French player is Varé, but Zayas, having a higher SR, decides to activate before him. After a failed attempt to fire, another unit manages to place itself under a fixed bayonets marker, and then a third unit goes down the slope, fails the assault, but rolls a 9, so that's a special event card for the Spanish player. This is a good event because that will allow the Spanish player to gain the initiative contest against a French leader with higher SR, which might be useful later in the game. The unit that failed its assault still can fire. It does so, rolls a 0, inflicting a full step loss to the French unit, plus a TEM check. Another bad roll, another 9. The French player gets to draw another special event card. It doesn't like it, so he discards it right away and places the unit under a disorder marker. In order to protect its flanks and increase its TEM, the last Spanish unit in good order there is gonna change formation into square. Then we turn our attention to the 2 disordered units at the bottom of the map, sorry for the shaky cam, and try to reform them. Unfortunately, both reform checks are failed, but the second roll was a 9 once again, so another card is drawn by the Spanish player. Once again, not a very good card, so it's right away discarded. Zayas is done, is put on the activated leader stack. And now the Spanish player selects Lardizabal, but the French player decides to activate Varé before Lardizabal, and he can do that because Varé has a higher SR, and so Varé is put on top of the stack. Both Grenadier battalions are moved. The first one passes its assault check, but the second one, even though it moves adjacent to the Spanish unit, that unit cannot perform a rotation because the movement factor of the Grenadier battalion is 7. Spanish unit has 5, so it cannot perform the reaction because the MF is lower. Another 9 rolled on the assault check. That's another card drawn. This one is good. It's going to allow one of the CG of the French player to reduce its fatigue by 2 during the rally phase. So it is exchanged for another card that the French player doesn't like. The unit still fires, and I swear those are original rolls. It's another 9, another card drawn, not a good card, it's discarded. Varé is done, but the last card of the French player is Gazan. He has nothing to do, so it's discarded with Varé. And Burial is similarly put on the activated stack. So Ballesteros will be the last leader to act during the operations phase. A few attempts to fire at enemy units are made, but nothing happens. So we can skip the out of play phase and proceed to the assault phase. The first assault is resolved by the French player because he has the initiative. Receive check is passed, but the result of the assault is a disorder, which forces the stack to rout. Because it's forced to rout into another French reaction zone, it will lose another step before being put in the routed unit box. After the French advance after combat, the Spanish player can resolve his assault. The French unit fails its receive check, and so it routs before the assault has to be resolved. The next one has odds 1 versus 1. 5 is rolled, so it's a firefight, which means that there is no effect. And finally, the Spanish unit on the left flank manages to pass its TEM check, and the Grenadiers Battalion manages to botch the assault and becomes disordered. So at the end of the turn, the only three things we have to do during the cleanup phase are return all leader cards to each player's hands, adjust the fatigue levels, and finally move the hours and minutes markers. And that's how the turn and tracks sheet should look like after this game turn. Note that now both Spanish CGs are in the yellow zone for fatigue, so they're going to suffer a -1 TEM, a -1 to their fire value, and a detrimental DRM to their melee rolls. Okay, so the first thing we do during the game turn is to try to rally the routed units. French player fails to rally his only routed unit, so the unit is eliminated because it was its last step. Same thing for the Spanish player. 2 failed rally rolls eliminate 2 units, but he manages to rally the third one that's placed under a disordered marker and then placed on the map according to the rallied units placement rules. However, here we make a mistake. We count 7 X's, so we move the unit one more, but we fail to notice that Grenadier Battalion on the left, that's still 7 X's from the unit, so it should have been moved one more X further, but that's not going to influence the rest of the game anyway. The French player now plays his special event Arrivée des Vivandières, which allows him to move 1 fatigue marker left to 2 boxes on the track. He chooses the first division and moves the marker accordingly. Once again, initial leader selection during the operations phase. We select both Girard and Zayas again. Girard will go first. So as there is no maneuver happening during that activation, we'll just speed up the activation. There is 1 failed artillery fire there, no depletion, and then we have 3 successful assaults. So 3 units are placed under fixed bayonet markers. Gazan will then help with the reform rolls for the 2 disordered units in that stack. One of them fails, the other one passes, so the unit that is still disordered has to be displaced. The other one is placed under a column marker. And we lied when we said there would be no maneuver during that activation. There is that stack there that will switch formation into column, then move through the other stack, switch back to line, attempt to assault, that's a fail, then fires, causes stragglers and a TEM check, but the Spanish unit passes the check. Girard's card is then put on the activated pile, and the French player selects Pépin to activate next. So Pépin moves with the first stack. It changes formation into line. When it reaches the destination, fires at the square and inflicts stragglers, but the TM check is passed. The artillery unit wants to move to get into a better firing position, so it passes a limbering check and moves. And the train unit follows the artillery down the road. Okay, now so the second stack is going to start moving, and in order to avoid the steep slope, we decide to go through the unit in line that's adjacent to the square. The problem here is that this is an illegal move, as you can see by checking the rule book for movement restrictions. The last bullet of the inset there shows that when you cross a hex that already contains a unit in line with 2 steps or more, you cannot enter its hex from the back and cross to the front or vice versa. And that's because a unit in line with 2 steps or more is considered to block the 2 front exit in the hex it occupies. So that move would have resulted in the unit in line being disordered, but unfortunately we missed it, so we'll continue playing. After the move, the unit declares a fire attack and manages to inflict a full step loss and a TM check. TM check is failed, so the square turns into a stack of disordered units. Then we make the same mistake with the next stack by crossing the line, but that doesn't really matter because there was a movement path that could have been taken at the bottom of the screen, so it really has no effect on the game. The unit passes its assault check and is placed under a fixed bayonet marker. The last unit from the CG is moved and Pépin is done and placed on the activated pile. Once again, Varé is selected as the next French leader, but Zayas goes on top of the stack and activates first. We got some effective fire from the Spanish units that cause both 1 straggler and 1 stragglers and disorder result. Now we attempt to reform the 2 units at the back there. The first one is a fail. We roll a 9, draw a special event card. This card could actually be used right away to rally that unit, but the Spanish player decides to keep it in case he fails to reform the guards unit, which is exactly what happens, and so the card is used to pass the check even though the roll was a fail. The disorder marker is removed and the unit is switched to a column formation. Zayas is placed on the activated stack, and Lardizabal is played as the next Spanish leader card. However, the Spanish leader will play his special event, so that even though Lardizabal has a lower SR than Vare, he can activate before him. Playing that card now is actually not so useful. A smarter Spanish player would have played that card on Zayas, so Zayas could have attempted to prevent the assaults from Girard by activating before him. Oh well. Not much happens here. Those units only manage to inflict a straggler's loss on one of the French units, and that's all. Varhe is then activated. One of the units retreats to be able to reform later, and the other one manages to put itself under a fixed bayonets marker. Finally, Gazan decides to move to support the assault of the unit that just got disordered. Burial has nothing to do, so the operations phase is over. We now have to resolve the 4 French assaults. During the first one, the Spanish unit fails its TEM check. Notice that even though I rolled a 3 and the unit's TEM is 3, that unit suffers a -1 to its TEM because of the fatigue being in the yellow zone. So it fails the check. And that's another 9 when we resolve the melee. Even though the roll is bad, the melee still manages to rout the Spanish unit because of the high odds. So we have an advance after combat, which brings the French unit adjacent to Lardizabal and forces him to retire on the closest friendly unit. He chooses the one on the top, but retiring also causes the leader to become passive. The next assault is resolved, and even though it's a special result, which would be a firefight if the unit was assaulting the enemy's front, in this case it's assaulting its flank hex, so the unit becomes disordered. The French player now has a clear superiority in numbers and starts mopping up all the units on the hill by routing them one after the other, so that scenario is probably going to end up in a French victory. The last assault there results in a natural 0 rolled, which should have triggered a casualty check for the Spanish player, but we forgot. However, even with a 0, the result is still a firefight, so nothing happens. We are now in the cleanup phase of the turn. The leader cards are returned to each player's hands, fatigue markers are advanced, and the clock handles are moved, showing that we are entering the last turn of the scenario, 11:30. So we start by attempting to rally the routed units. The Spanish player fails to rally any of his units. He rolls a 9 there, but he doesn't draw a card because during the rally phase, you are not allowed to draw a special events card. We start the operations phase by selecting the leaders. It's pretty much the same leader selection as the other turns. It's a pretty small scenario, so it's again Girard and Zayas that are selected initially. The first stack we move is the disordered stack that's adjacent to a Spanish unit, so we move it so it can reform later. Gazan is actually moving with that stack, so his card has to be placed also on the activated pile. A few units pass their assault check and are placed under fixed bayonets markers. Then we have an effective artillery fire, stragglers, but the TM check is passed, so no further effect. There's no depletion. The French battalion moves adjacent to the unit on the hill. They need to clear that hill to ensure victory. So it attempts to assault but fails the check, then fires, creates a casualty. The 2 stragglers turn into a full step loss. And the stack fails its EM check, so it disorders. There is 1 reform attempt that is failed, and then 1 unit that moves and that assaults the unit on the hill. Pépin is selected as the next leader to take his activation. The activation is not very eventful. He's just going to cover the northern flank of the French army by positioning his units and attacking that reformed guards unit. Now the artillery moves to put itself in position to fire on that guards unit, but Technically, we should have moved the train first so that when the unit fires, it's able to be supplied by the train unit within 3 hexes. So we should have moved the train unit first, then the artillery unit, and then fired at the end of the artillery unit's activation. The fire has no effect anyway, and there is no depletion. And one final successful assault check that probably spells the doom of the Spanish units on the hill. Varey is selected as the next French leader, and Zayas lets him activate first. So one unit reforms and is placed under a column marker, and the other one passes its assault check, which means another assault against the last Spanish unit there on the left flank. Zayas is next, but the only unit that can really do anything is that unit that's being assaulted at the bottom of the screen, so it's going to attempt to fire on the French unit, but rolls a 7 and there is no effect. Finally, we activate Lardizabal. One unit fires on the unit that is assaulting it and manages to inflict a Strider's loss, which combined to the previous Strider's loss becomes a full step loss. The TM is passed though, so the French unit does not disorder. We get a bunch of units that disorder on the left side of the map there, and then we have a unit that is forced to retreat in a route. It cannot find a path without crossing an enemy reaction zone, so it loses an additional step. Finally, the most important assault of the game. If the French player manages to make those units on the hill retreat in route, then he wins the game. If he doesn't, well, then it's a Spanish victory. Unfortunately for the Spanish player, he rolls a 9 on a TEM receive check, and so the stack retreats in route. The only chance he has to not retreat in route is to draw a special event card that would allow him to pass that check, but unfortunately he doesn't draw it. So the stack retreats, and both French stacks advance after combat because they are both in different formations. They also disorder. And so the French player wins, clearing the 3 victory hexes indicated by stars there. However, the Spanish player could have played a little better, especially using that activation card to interrupt the French players. So in the end, the scenario is pretty evenly balanced. I hope you enjoyed this quick overview of infantry combat in the fixed bayonet system, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.